All right. Well, StreamYard crapped out on me there for a second, but we're going to keep going. I'm going to get this done. So, for the live stream version of this book, I'm going to reread the last paragraph. And then once I hit decision making, I got to remember to hit record on GarageBand to make the high quality version for when this is all over. So, let's put up the book again right here. Okay. There we are. If someone can hear me, so you can hear me. I missed that comment from earlier. Guy said I was doing a good job. I appreciate that, man. All right, it looks good again. Let me just double check that I can hear myself. Make sure I can hear myself. All right, it looks okay. Still kind of off and on. I'm fine with that as long as I'm live and I can record. Okay. Here we go. Let's get me out of there. There we go. Military-industrial complex and lower levels of capital, less interested in the long-term global dominance of Western monopoly capital. They just want to make money, and making money means maintaining economic growth. The military-industrial complex is concerned with the domestic U.S. economy, which is continuing to grow more dire as the post-industrial vision of some globally minded elites plays out. They reject the degrowth agenda intended to stabilize capitalism, as it will cut into the profits and lock them out of decision making. Oh, thanks, man. Hey, we'll stop to say hello to the author here, Mr. Caleb Maupin, the one and only, the American Lenin. I think so, in my heart. I'm learning a lot here, buddy. And hey, anything to get these ideas out there, they're very important. Very important. So I'm about to hit record on GarageBand, so I won't be able to stop reading the book because I like to try to get it all in one take. But I'm so glad you're here, and I hope we're doing a good job for you. Hope you're proud of the product, because I'm proud of you for writing this book, my man. It's the least I can do. All right, here we go. We're going to hit record and start on furthermore. Let me just listen back, make sure it's at the right spot. Oh, man, that version's going to sound so much better, I think. Okay, here we go. Lock them out of decision making. 1, 2, 3. Oh, thanks, buddy. You're the best. You're the best. One comrade to another. Here we go. Lock them out of decision making. Furthermore, the military strength and potential human costs of a war with Russia and China are much more apparent to those who sit in the Pentagon, calculating the risks and running scenarios each day. Behind many of Tulsi Gabbard and Tucker Carlson's warnings about escalation with Russia is a knowledge of facts that the Dr. Strangelove type academics refuse to acknowledge. Unlike intelligence-linked occultist guru Marilyn Ferguson, who served as Al Gore's spiritual advisors, the Pentagon wing of the U.S. deep state is not fantasizing about the libidinal release of a massive conflagration that would bring the world back into balance with nature. The pagan primitivism of New Left occultism and its destructive fantasies horrify many of the evangelicals and conservative-minded thinkers in the lower levels of the elite. While the Eastern establishment is hell-bent on propping up the decaying Western order, the military-industrial complex just wants to make money. Among many of the wealthy, there is a growing desire for an economic reboot here at home. The knowledge that a wave of investment and partnerships with China and its allies in the world could make this happen remains an unspoken truth. For those in the United States whose only concern is expanding their profit margins, not securing the monopoly of U.S. bankers, peace and economic cooperation with the explosion of development led by China around the world should be very appealing. There is also an ideological component to this reshuffling of U.S. political discourse. After the political confusion of the 1970s, the U.S. military establishment rebuilt its strength with the Christian right. This was a new synthesis of rock and roll music, watered down religious revivalism, patriotism, and social conservatism. After neoconservatism died with the 2008 financial crisis, the liberal order that now has the upper hand has made support for homosexuality and transgenderism, along with opposition to religion, as one of its primary focuses. The liberal order wants to break down all forms of authority that could form as the basis of opposition. The patriarchal father figure, the priest, the pastor, the military strongman, all could get in the way of the social engineering planned by Silicon Valley. Netflix is constantly inoculating its viewers against any voice that inspires passion and claims to represent universal truth. The liberal order wants to abolish ideology, abolish all ties that bind human beings to each other, and allow for itself to have a complete monopoly over the mind of the public. The military brass is made up of people with a much more illiberal mindset, for whom religion and ideological structure have always been key. Tulsi Gabbard, for example, is a Hindu, an adherent of one of the groups that broke away from the Hare Krishna movement, a Hindu sect that proliferated in the US during the 1960s and 70s. Her organization is not Christian or rooted in European practices, but it opposes gay marriage and sexual promiscuity and urges its adherents to live a regimented life. While similar groups were promoted by the U.S. intelligence apparatus in the 1970s as an alternative to communism, they now find themselves targeted by the liberal order and back into a reluctant alliance or sympathy with Russia and China. Just as the liberal order seeks to destroy the ideology of Marxism-Leninism, Bolivarian socialism, Shia Islam, and Russian nationalism, it also wants to destroy the ideology of Protestant evangelical, the Catholic Church, and any other illiberal institution or organization. The liberal order is just as much a threat to the way of life and worldview of the Pentagon brass as it is to socialists and communists. This all lays the basis for an anti-imperialist bloc to emerge in U.S. politics. The lower-level capitalists and the military want to see the domestic U.S. economy revived. The labor unions and the bulk of the population, excluding the urban middle class, want to see this as well. Such an economic revival is in the interests of Russia and China as well, and trading with them to make it happen is likely a necessity and would possibly help shield them from imperialist attacks. The bulk of U.S. society, the overwhelming majority, do not benefit from degrowth policies and war agenda of the ultra-rich. This alignment of direct material interests leaves the big monopolies with their urban middle-class foot soldiers pretty alone and outnumbered. The only hope the imperialists have is mesmerizing wider chunks of society with social media or sowing division. If polarization along these specific lines of direct material interests matures, the emergence of a revolutionary anti-imperialist government in America is the logical conclusion. The kind of polarization against the imperialists that once took place in formerly colonized nations seems to be fitting for the United States in this era of capitalism in decay. Even today, the Chinese government bears the name the People's Republic. China's form of government is described in its constitution as a people's democratic dictatorship, i.e., a coalition government representing anti fascist and anti imperialist forces under the leadership of the Communist Party. This follows the theory of people's democracy, which was the basis for the foundation of governments led by communist parties across the planet following the Second World War. The Chinese flag bears one big yellow star with four smaller yellow stars next to it. The four small yellow stars symbolize the block of four great classes, which came together to establish the People's Republic. These four great classes were the peasantry, the working class, the land-owning middle peasants, and the national bourgeoisie, i.e., capitalists who were loyal to China against US and British imperialism. The large yellow star represents the Communist Party and directs the four great classes with its proletarian ideology and understanding of the objective laws of history. The Communist Party, while representing most specifically the interests of the proletarian class, positioned itself as the liberator of the entire country, at the center of a broad coalition to build a new China free from the oppression of the imperialists. The four small stars on the Chinese flag represent the peasants, the workers, the middle peasants, and the national capitalists, the block of four great classes. The large star represents the Communist Party, which unified them against the imperialists. The Communist Party and the Anti-Monopoly Coalition. In 1948, just a year before the Chinese Communists took power, William Z. Foster explained the vision of the U.S. Communists for building a similar united front. In order for the people to put the United States firmly on the path toward peace, democracy, and general well-being, the power of the monopolists who dominate our country must be curbed and finally broken, and the people themselves must take political charge under the leadership of the working class. The struggle for socialism grows inevitably out of the everyday fight of the workers and their allies, especially against the present menaces of economic chaos, fascism, and war. In all good times, the American people, on the basis of their existing conditions, will decide how and in what forms they will introduce socialism. The way our party foresees the possible development of the future is along the following general lines. First, we propose the regular election of a democratic coalition government based on a broad united front combination of workers, small farmers, Negroes, professionals, small business groups, and other democratic elements who are ready to fight against monopoly, economic breakdown, fascism, and war. This type of united front government could well have behind it an overwhelming majority of the people, and it has, as it has in other lands. It goes without saying that the election of such a democratic government could only be brought about in the face of powerful and very surely violent opposition from organized reaction. The whole history of the American class struggle, which is full of examples of employer violence and strikes and in other mass struggles, teaches this lesson with unmistakable clarity. Obviously, it would be an extremely difficult proposition to elect a truly democratic government in the face of this strong, violent, and reactionary opposition. Second, our party contends that such an anti-fascist, anti-war, democratic coalition government, once in power, would be compelled either to move to the left or to die. With state power in its hands, it would be forced to pass over from a more or less defensive program upon which it was elected to an offensive policy. Confronted with the sabotage and open resistance of big business, it would have no other alternative than this. if it hoped to realize any of the progressive legislation of its program and to ensure its staying in power. A people's government was forced to proceed directly to curb and undermine the power of the monopolies by adopting far-reaching policies of nationalization of the banks and major industries, the breakup of big land holdings, the beginning of a planned economy, the elimination of reactionary elements from the control of the army, schools, and industry, as well as various other measures to weaken monopoly and to strengthen the working class as the leading progressive force in the nation. Third, a democratic, anti-fascist, anti-war government under the violent attacks of the capitalists and in its efforts to find solutions to the burning economic and political problems, if it were to survive, would necessarily move leftward towards socialism, much as the people's democracies of Eastern and Central Europe are now doing. Some liberals believe that a united front coalition government in this country would introduce a regime of progressive capitalism, but this is a naive and dangerous illusion. Capitalism is now in its monopoly stage and is hopelessly reactionary. Any people's government in our times, in order to be progressive or even to live, inevitably must move towards socialism. American socialism, beyond question, will have its own specific forms and methods, but basically, it will be the same as socialism in other countries, with monopoly capital completely defeated, the industries and national resources in the hands of the people, production for general use instead of for profit, and the working class the leader of the whole people. Only in this way will this country and the world be finally freed of the dangers of poverty, economic chaos, fascist slavery, and murderous war. These steps could be taken legally by a people's government, notwithstanding the opposition of the capitalists, however violent. To promote the election of a progressive coalition government of this type, which, by force of circumstances, would move to the left and eventually to socialism on the general pattern of the European people's democracies, is obviously not to advocate a program of force and violence, the enemies of the Communist Party to the contrary notwithstanding. The charge by the Department of Justice that our party advocates the forcible overthrow of the government is a brazen, conscious lie. Is it possible to elect such a democratic coalition, anti-monopoly government in the United States, the stronghold of world capitalism? It is a sinister fact that civil rights in this country, notably since the end of the war, have been seriously whittled away. But the United States is by no means at the stage of fascism, nor do we communists consider American fascism to be inevitable. The big popular upsurge in the recent presidential elections was a dramatic justification of our faith in the strength of the American people. It showed a profound anti-fascist, anti-war sentiment among the masses. In the event of an economic crisis or a war, this mass democratic upsurge would be vastly greater and more clear-sighted. Our party's political line is thus based upon the assumption that it is possible, under present political conditions in the United States, for the broad masses of the people, militantly led by the trade unions and a strong mass political party, to elect a coalition anti-monopoly government. How long this possibility may last in the face of the fascist trends in this country is problematical. But if we should get fascism, if the United States were to be reduced to the level of fascist Spain, then the communists will also know how to reshape their policies to meet that kind of situation. It may well be asked, what resistance will American capitalism be able to make when the great masses of the people finally decide, as they surely will, to establish socialism? Today, American capitalism is strong, but it is not as strong as it appears to be, nor has it got a permanent lien on its present strength. Now, it is true, Wall Street is the world bully and trying to organize civil wars in various countries and to arm itself and other. But what will its power of resistance to socialism be when, as may be likely, the vast bulk of the rest of the world has gone socialist? When its own foreign markets have largely dried up? When it is undermined by economic crises? When it may have just about wrecked itself by its projected world war? And when its working class has developed a Marxist Leninist ideology and sets out to bring about socialism? It may well turn out that it will be far easier for the American working class, in the midst of a socialist world, to establish socialism in this country than now appears to be the case, with American capitalism at the peak of its strength. Who can foretell these things? Certainly, we Marxist Leninists do not indulge in such prophecy. In the midst of the McCarthyite witch hunts and prosecution from the Department of Justice, the Communist Party USA understood what its job was. They were to try and build what William Z. Foster later called it an anti-monopoly coalition. In the name of peace, higher wages, the labor movement, racial equality, and anti-fascism, the broad majority of the American people were to be brought together in a coalition to reject Wall Street and its agenda of war and fascism. A government that represented all the forces of opposition was to be brought to power and defended from the onslaught of opposition from the American power structure. In order to defeat the attacks of the big monopolies and the U.S. power structure, such a government would then be forced to change the nature of the policing agencies, the military, and the economy, and establish what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. With the state in its hands, the Communist Party and its allies could begin transforming the United States prosperous socialist society, no longer held back by the shortcomings of capitalism and its restraints on human productivity. In 1948, U.S. Communist Party leader William Z. Foster laid out the strategy of building an anti-monopoly coalition to fight for an anti-war government. Unfortunately, the Communist Party was unable to achieve this goal. The FBI and the mobilization of the public around anti-communist hysteria in the post-war years effectively weakened the party, reducing it to a core of less than 10,000 members, two-thirds of which lived in New York City. The Communist Party was forced to operate in a semi-clandestine manner, with the national board sent to prison and publications banned from the mail. After the death of Stalin, the media's repudiation of Joe McCarthy, and the execution of the Rosenbergs, as the Cold War began to thaw, the Communist Party gradually emerged to publicly function again. When Khrushchev gave his secret speech in 1956 at the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, the remaining loyal cadre who endured so much persecution felt utterly demoralized. The leader of the Soviet Union was saying that all the allegations made against Stalin in the US media were, in fact, true. Many resigned and abandoned communism immediately. Then in 1957, the US Supreme Court legalized the Communist Party in the Yates versus the United States ruling, saying the party could legally exist as long as it did not advocate violence, engage in espionage, or function as unregistered agents of a foreign government. What the court solidified had already become the practice of U.S. officials prior to the ruling. Starting amid 1956, the Communist Party was free to have a public office in Manhattan again and hold meetings in New York City. It appears this was seen as some kind of favor to the Soviet Union, a diplomatic gesture showing that the U.S. was more than willing to negotiate with the Khrushchevites who had just taken power. Eugene Dennis emerged as the Communist Party's new spokesperson, having an event in Madison Square Garden, proposing a merger with Norman Thomas's Socialist Party. A document called "The Communists Take a New Look" was widely circulated by the party, announcing that at the upcoming convention, the Communist Party was considering officially dropping Marxism-Leninism as its ideology and its relationship with the Soviet Union. This coincided with Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign in the Soviet Union and Mao's 100 Flowers campaign in China. In 1957, the Communist Party leadership battled against two dissident factions. The first faction, led by William Z. Foster and many African American leaders that refused to embrace Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. This faction also held on to the Black Belt thesis that presented African Americans as an oppressed nationality. The hardliners were roundly defeated. Nelson Peary writes about his departure from the Communist Party. The effect on the American Communist Party was catastrophic. Hundreds of militant comrades, declaring Khrushchev had destroyed socialism, quit the party. I never would have left the CP just because I disagreed with its projections or disliked some of its leaders, any more than I would have deserted my platoon because I hated George Patton or because Douglas MacArthur had referred to us as a bunch of N-words spontaneously. The party began to break up into the factions that had formed its base. I thought somebody should do something, but I no longer belonged to the party, and there was nothing I could do. Eugene Dennis and his allies, such as Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, defeated Foster by aligning with another dissident faction led by John Gates. Gates favored liquidating the Communist Party, cutting ties to the Soviet Union, and becoming a mass party of socialism. While Foster went into retirement as chairman emeritus, most of his allies resigned or were expelled, laying the basis for the anti-revisionist groups of the coming years. The first attempt at a regroupment among those from the Foster faction was the Provisional Organizing Committee, though later the Progressive Labor Party, PLP, and Hammer and Steel emerged as anti-revisionist breakaways. Joseph R. Starobin's American Communism in Crisis, 1943 to 1957, describes how the fallout of Khrushchev's secret speech really rendered the CPUSA completely impotent. He writes, "In 1958, no regeneration of the CP seemed probable. The party no longer had the participation, even indirectly, of those it had once considered its most valuable supporters. No other political force on the left had any impact on the Communist Party's ultimate crisis. No other wing of the left could inherit those who could not remain communists. None of American communism's ideological kinfolk benefited from the debacle. Though hopes rose in different sects and groups, neither the CP's strict adherence to Marxism-Leninism over a decade, nor its acceptance of revisionism for the second time, enabled it to maintain political momentum. Nor did the CP recover from the debacle once the revisionists of 1956 to 1957 had withdrawn. Within a few years, most of the old leaders were to pass away from obscure internecine battles. What remained of the Communist Party has played a most inconsequential role in the 60s. The New Left is a phenomenon which owes little to communism, does not understand its lessons, and does not seem to care." Shortly after the 1958 convention, John Gates and his allies were pushed out of the Communist Party as well, as ties to the Soviet Union were seen as non-negotiable. Gus Hall emerged from federal prison to become the Communist Party's primary public face for the coming decades. The ranks of the Communist Party from then on have always been less than 2,000 members, except for a slight uptick during the early 1970s. It appears that when the Communist Party resurfaced in 1956, it was doing so under the direct permission and supervision of American intelligence agencies, most specifically the FBI. Most of the leaders had been in prison and were unsupervised parole. Later, it was revealed National Committee member Morris Childs was an FBI informant from the early 1950s onward, and that he was tasked with smuggling millions of dollars in cash from the Soviet Union to fund the Communist Party's activities. Morris Childs received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan for his activities managing and controlling the Communist Party under the direction of the FBI. From 1957 onward, the Communist Party's existence was a gesture to the Soviet Union. The Communist Party was used to help American intelligence court the reformist wing of the Soviet government that eventually oversaw the collapse in 1991. The Communist Party sowed the illusion that the Democratic Party wanted détente and only the hard right wing wanted to destroy Russia. Within the United States, the Communist Party worked hard to channel U.S. dissidents away from militant actions and into functioning as volunteers for the Democratic Party. Today, the Communist Party USA exists to serve similar purposes. It works to court China, Vietnam, and Cuba's leaders to be allies of the Democratic Party. It also works to channel youth who are interested in communism toward being Democratic Party activists. Communist Party leaders monitor and track other leftist groups, reporting on their activities to Democratic Party leaders and indirectly to U.S. government agencies. Jacobin Magazine, Democratic Socialists of America, Correspondents for Democracy and Socialism play a similar role. These are the State Department socialists of our time, and they have a particular grudge against the leaders of contemporary Russia, most of whom come from the wing of the Soviet bureaucracy and the KGB, who rejected their overtures and became more socially conservative and nationalistic during the final years of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party has also cut ties with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, opposing its proliferation of nuclear weapons. The new communist movement. It is fair to say that from 1956 onward, the U.S. Communist Party stopped working to build an anti-monopoly coalition, a vehicle for Cold War intrigue and back-channel communications and intelligence operations. However, during the 1970s, there were a few other organizations that emerged and took it upon themselves to carry out the tasks the Communist Party set for itself in 1948. The civil rights and anti-Vietnam War protest movements of the 1960s, the New Left, spawned a generation of young Americans who were interested in communism. Among young black activists associated with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a secret communist organization called the Revolutionary Action Movement was formed in 1962. The group set out to build a new communist party that would fight for the liberation of black people in America. It took inspiration from the radio broadcasts of Robert F. Williams, Radio Free Dixie, transmitted across the U.S. South from Havana. The new communist movement was rooted in 1960s civil rights and anti-war activities, who sought to build a new mass communist party aligned with China. Malcolm X met with RAM members and voiced support for their efforts, and some clandestine armed groups were able to recruit and operate among the wider trend of black nationalism. Eventually, two activists associated with RAM, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, broke away to form the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which emerged as the primary black communist organization in the United States, attracting the admiration of millions and tens of thousands of active members. The Black Panthers faced heavy FBI repression and infiltration, with Fred Hampton being assassinated. In 1969, Eldridge Cleaver and his followers broke away from the Black Panther Party and launched a series of left adventurous attacks on police officers. Huey Newton then steered the rest of the party toward pursuing policies called survival pending revolution, such as the free breakfast program. The Black Panthers aimed to eventually merge into a multinational party with white, Latino, Asian, and Chicano activists as part of Newton's theory of intercommunalism. During the same period, many white anti-war activists joined Students for a Democratic Society, which had originated as a liberal pacifist organization. By 1969, Students for a Democratic Society was dominated by the Progressive Labor Party and the Revolutionary Youth Movement, RYM, two Marxist-Leninist factions whose stated goal was to build a new communist party to defeat American imperialism. After the breakup of SDS at the 1969 convention, PLP cut ties with China and Vietnam and also expressed hostility to the Black Panthers. RYM leadership began calling for militant street activism and left adventurous terrorism, eventually dissolving into the Weather Underground organization and carrying out symbolic bombings. Those in RYM who rejected the left adventurous tactics of the Weathermen and continued looking to China, Vietnam, and the Black Panthers as allies formed Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, RYM2. RYM2 took instruction from the Black Panthers and aimed to build a communist organization among white industrial workers that would support the Black Panthers, China, and global anti-imperialist forces. RYM2 laid the basis for what has been called the New Communist Movement, a trend of U.S. politics during the 1970s that has been documented in books such as Mac Elbaum's Revolution in the Air, Aaron Leonard's Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying by Dan Georgakis, and many other academic works. The NCM rejected the hippie counterculture. Its members cut their hair short, abstained from drug use, and often denounced sexual promiscuity and homosexuality as bourgeois decadence. The movement broke up into many different sects and tendencies, all of whom looked to China for inspiration, sought to bring communist politics out of radical intellectual circles and to the broader American working class. Most NCM organizations oriented their members to work in factories and attempted to form shop nuclei, as the Communist Party had done during the 1920s and 30s. Detroit is the only city where the NCM that was significantly successful. Detroit is the only city where the NCM was significantly successful. In the mostly African American city, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, led by lawyer Kenneth Cockrell, recruited hundreds of members and had significant influence among auto workers. Mel Rovitz, a lawyer who openly called himself a Maoist communist, was elected for a term as a criminal court judge. Many on Detroit's council. Coleman Young, a black activist who was a close friend of the Communist Party USA and had briefly been a member of the anti-revisionist Provisional Organizing Committee during the late 1950s, became mayor in 1974. The Communist Labor Party, led by Nelson Peary, maintained a significant layer of influence in Detroit during the 1970s and even up into the 1980s, with General Gordon Baker being considered an influential figure. The successes of the new communist movement were limited, but in Detroit, the DOGE Revolutionary Union movement, a radical faction of the Auto Workers Union, gained significant influence. Detroit City Council member Joanne Watson also began her career in politics as an NCM activist. The 1970s NCM was able to make significant alliances with the Arab American population of Dearborn, Michigan, near Detroit. Dearborn is the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the United States, with significant Iraqi, Yemeni, and Syrian communities. Protests against Israel and activism in solidarity with Libya and the Democratic People's Republic of Yemen took place. However, beyond Detroit, the NCM was largely unsuccessful. The reason was that the U.S. economy was still strong. The U.S. industrial working class enjoyed union wages and a high living standard, and as a result, was uninterested in communism and anti imperialism. The problem of labor aristocracy that Lenin described decades earlier was a major factor, and the U.S. had not yet been deindustrialized. The Boston Trap. The NCM made a point veering away from standard left wing politics, understanding that the counterculture elements were marginal and that it was necessary to build a base among the working class. This led to some interesting instances of cooperation with the right wing. For example, in 1974, evangelical Christians who objected to Darwin's theory of evolution, other cultural conservatives in Kanawha County, West Virginia, engaged in a series of riots and bomb threats in response to the new school textbooks selected by the county school board. One bystander was shot during a protest, and schools closed for extended periods in response to threats. The Revolutionary Union and other NCM organizations supported these right-wing textbook riots on the grounds that working class people had the right to choose what curriculum their children should study in school. The rhetoric of the Maoist communists condemned middle-class liberals who looked down on the Appalachian coal miners and hailed the militancy and use of firearms by the local population in response to outrage about liberal textbooks. The most blatant and widely condemned example of NCM activists cooperating with the right wing was in 1974, when racist riots took place against school desegregation. White residents of Boston who objected to their children going to racially integrated schools formed an organization called Restore Our Alienated Rights, ROAR. From 1974 to 1976, 40 different riots occurred in which white Bostonians targeted black high school students. A number of stabbings, shootings, and bombings took place. Tear gas was deployed, and thousands were arrested in the wave of unrest. It was not only the racist white Irish American Bostonians who opposed busing, though they were the ones engaging the rioting and targeting black students labeled DSEGs with street violence. The Nation of Islam and the Black Panther Party also opposed school desegregation, saying they wanted black schools for black children and that racial integration was a plot by white liberals. The mistaken decision of some new communist movement groups to support the 1974 racist anti-busing riots in Boston pushed many leftists into the trap of assuming it is never acceptable to support anything labeled right-wing. It is also worth noting that school desegregation was promoted not only by civil rights activists and leftists, but also by the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller think tanks, and some of the most wealthy institutions in America. The Catholic urban political machines of Boston and many other urban centers were a barrier against austerity. The labor unions and community voting blocks of many ethnic neighborhoods represented a force to contend with in the effort to bring about cuts in government jobs and enact privatizations. The neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party understood that breaking apart these nepotistic and often very racist centers of local power was necessary to furthering their economic agenda. In the context of the racist riots, black nationalist opposition to busing and support for busing and condemnation of the riots by the mainstream media, a few of the NCM groups voiced support for the anti-busing riots. The Revolutionary Union proclaimed the people must unite to smash the Boston busing on the front page of its newspaper. The Revolutionary Union defended its position, writing, "Those who think that the only way to stand with black people and other oppressed nationalities is to attack white workers is simply a bunch of racists who think the ruling class is a friend of the oppressed, can at best only drag at the tail of the struggle, and if they continue in this path, can only end up falling over backwards completely onto the camp of the ruling class." The October League, another black nationalists who opposed busing. Meanwhile, the Workers' World Party dispatched almost its entire membership to Boston to organize a protest called "We Say No to Racism." WWP members hide their communist views, and the protest that attracted around 20,000 people to oppose the racist anti-busing riots featured Democratic Party speakers and local elected officials. At the march, Workers' World Party sought to lead the crowd to defy police orders, but marshals from the Socialist Workers' Party actively prevented a wider confrontation with the police from breaking out. The Revolutionary Union and its successor organization, the Revolutionary Communist Party, were widely condemned for pandering to racism and supporting ROAR. The book, Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists, describes how the RU's position was ridiculed widely on the left, and inside its own ranks, it created serious dissension. The political fallout would have lasting consequences for the RU in terms of loss of prestige, if not legitimacy, in certain quarters. The incident led to a consensus among U.S. communist activists that one must never support the right wing and make the mistake of the activists who supported the anti-busing riots. The NCM's instinct of breaking with the mainstream left and finding common ground with backward workers who were engaged in a confrontation with the U.S. political establishment was seen as a deep flaw. This assumption that every movement or sentiment labeled right wing must be condemned, and that any effort to distance oneself from the liberals and find common ground with such people is a huge blunder, is rightly called the Boston Trap. It was certainly incorrect for the Maoists to align with the textbook rioters and the racist Bostonians, but this historical movement cannot be projected onto all circumstances. Trump supporters and MAGA conservatives in the 2020s, for the most part, are not racist mobs attacking black children. Their views are wildly incorrect, but their targets of opposition and political goals are often not far from those of anti-imperialists. Liberalism and the synthetic left have deteriorated into a defense of U.S. military interventions, the FBI, economically devastating lockdowns, cancel culture, and the U.S. political establishment itself. Many Americans labeled right-wing openly seek an end to the police state, an end to the wars, and the economic rejuvenation of the Rust Belt. The words quoted above from the RU's defense of its mistaken position are oddly prophetic. Decades later, it appears most socialists have fallen over backwards, completely into the camp of the ruling class. The Great Retreat. The failure of the various NCM groups to expand their base of support or recruit new cadres became a source of frustration as the 1970s proceeded. It was accompanied by the fact that the country to which they turned for political guidance was rapidly changing. The Gang of Four put forward the notion that China could reach a higher stage in poverty, and that full communism could be achieved without industrialization and economic development, on the basis of having the correct political line. China's foreign policy shifted in the early 1970s, aligning with the United States against the Soviet Union. The Gang of Four condemned Soviet social imperialism, which they labeled the main danger. As the Cultural Revolution grew uglier, the Gang of Four's politics became more absurd and pessimistic. American writer William Hinton presented China's foreign policy views in an interview with The Guardian published May 5, 1976, saying that a third world war was considered inevitable. Stating what he assessed as the main foreign policy view of Beijing during the last years of the Gang of Four, he stated, "We asked about war. Can a third world war be prevented? The thinking in China is that short of revolution in the US and the USSR, a third world war is inevitable. The people of the world can take measures that may delay war, but as long as these two great powers, the American and the Russian, exist in their present form and content for dominance, war is bound to come. Détente is an illusion, a smokescreen that covers up underlying stark reality, an arms buildup leading to war." The thinking in Peking seems to be, in 3 to 5 years, war is unlikely. In 10 years, it is a possibility. If one thinks in terms of a 30-year period, the time that has elapsed since World War II, it is likely to be sooner rather than later. Another 30 years without a world war? Impossible. Does world war mean nuclear war? Not necessarily. The feeling is that a major world war might well be fought with conventional arms. Even a nuclear war will not destroy mankind. Mankind will destroy the bomb. The bomb will not destroy mankind. At least half the human race will survive. War will hasten revolution, and revolution will solve problems that have long been unsolved. Today, there is still a major contradiction between the peoples of the world and the two superpowers. But as between two superpowers, one, the Soviet Union, is more dangerous than the other. It is, in fact, the main danger confronting the whole world today. So now a more appropriate slogan would be, mobilize the third world, unite all the forces of the second world willing to struggle, neutralize the United States, and strike the main blow at the Soviet Union. China judges world leaders by how well they understand this new relationship of forces. Thus, they prefer Heath to Wilson, Strauss to Brandt, and Schlesinger to Kissinger. The NCM groups were heavily competitive with each other for China's approval, often engaging in strange behaviors intended to follow Beijing. For example, the October League held a protest against the teachings of Confucius at an American university to show support for the Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius campaign launched by the Red Guards in China. In 1976, Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai died, and his state funeral turned into an anti-communist riot. Young intellectuals saw Zhou Enlai as one of their few allies against the Red Guards and Gang of Four that were actively preventing China from economically developing. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping declared that the Cultural Revolution in China was over, and the Gang of Four were arrested for counter-revolutionary crimes. China began its reform and opening up, causing yet more confusion among its international allies. This shift in China's politics coincided with a significant economic downturn in the United States, as well as an upsurge of anti-imperialism around the world. The 1978 Saur Revolution in Afghanistan was followed by the Islamic Revolution of Iran and the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua. In these circumstances, many of the NCM organizations moved into a tragic desperation. Communist Workers' Party members in North Carolina challenged the Ku Klux Klan to a fight. They held a permitted protest in Greensboro called Death to the Klan and sent a provocative letter to the KKK, challenging them to show their faces. The Klan responded by coming to the event and shooting 5 communist activists. The event have been referred to as the Greensboro Massacre. The events have been referred to as the Greensboro Massacre. The KKK members were acquitted, and the Carter administration refused to bring federal charges. One of the people riding in the KKK caravan was Frazier Glenn Miller, who spent years in the FBI's witness protection program and later went on to carry out a mass shooting at a Jewish community center in Overland Park, Kansas in 2014, killing 3 people. On November 3rd, 1979, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 5 members of the Communist Workers' Party were killed by the Ku Klux Klan. The Revolutionary Communist Party split, with a low percentage of the members staying loyal to China and advocating that the party pursue United Front tactics. This faction was expelled or resigned, forming the Revolutionary Worker Headquarters and eventually laying the basis for Freedom Road Socialist Organization. The remaining members of the RCP declared that China had restored capitalism and rallied around Bob Avakian as their chairman. The RCP members staged a Death to Deng Xiaoping protest outside the White House with mass arrests and violence on January 29, 1979, with many people arrested and facing serious criminal charges as a result. The RCP followed up with a very provocative May Day 1980 campaign that resulted in scuffles with police and mobs of right-wing workers attacking RCP members across the country. The RCP made a point of publicly supporting the Iranian hostage takers and provoking right-wing crowds to attack them by burning flags. Steve Hamilton, who had been a founder of the Revolutionary Union, looked at the events with disappointment. Heavy Radicals quotes him as saying, "Now, in 1979, the RCP seems to have regressed to the kind of left adventurism that is reminiscent of the Weatherman days, also reminiscent of the later years of PL, when it found itself an isolated sect and a kind of go-for-broke mentality set in." Internally, the RCP became much more harsh and rigid. It was particularly feverish within the East Coast May Day Brigade. In a public mass meeting in New York, comrades were criticized and expelled from the party. The tone was ugly and dangerous. Leaders were removed and new leaders installed. Actions the party had encouraged just weeks before were now denounced as rightist. Overall, the bearings of the group were run amok. Heavy Radicals, 2014. The desperation and adventurism of the NCM groups reflected an understanding that after a decade in the factories attempting to build a new communist party, they were seeing little progress. Meanwhile, the international situation was changing in ways they could not really understand. The economic downturn of resulted in a rightward shift in American workers. Ronald Reagan swept the 1980 elections. In response, the NCM began to fizzle out. Michael Harrington and his associates formed the Democratic Socialists of America, and with a well-funded publication called In These Times, they began recruiting ex-communists into the Democratic Party and labor bureaucracy. The Democratic Workers' Party and the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, previously known as the October League, dissolved. Hang on just a second. Thought I shut all these alarms off, but one is going off somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. Hmm. Maybe it's on. I really don't know. Oh, there it is. Found it. All right. I'm going to listen back and see if I can hear it. If it's still, might have to reread that last paragraph. Let's see. I can. Let's see when it started. Yeah, it's there. I think it's right here. Okay. Let's see. Edit. Split regions of playhead. Edit. Split regions of playhead. Let's delete this part. Delete. Okay. Let's see where we got to without the annoying sound. Okay. I'm almost there. Meanwhile, okay, that's good. Let's write it a new paragraph. Okay. I cut it right there. Let's do edit, split, delete this. Okay, let's see how that sounds. That's perfect. Okay. I could not really understand. Okay, so let's share this again. Go back to that. There we go. I could not really understand. Here we go. Sorry about that. Helps me get it recorded right, though. All right. 1, 2, 3. The economic downturn of 1978 resulted in a rightward shift among most white American workers. Ronald Reagan swept the 1980 elections. In response, the NCM began to fizzle out. Michael Harrington and his associates formed the Democratic Socialists of America, and with a well-funded publication called In These Times, they began recruiting ex-communists into the Democratic Party and labor bureaucracy. The Democratic Workers' Party and the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, previously known as the October League, dissolved. The Revolutionary Communist Party declared at a Jimmy Buffett concert where he was surrounded by intoxicated youths as being pivotal in his shifting perspective, rejecting the need to win over the broad masses. Avakian recalls, As the struggle with these Mensheviks was developing and sharpening up a bit, after the revisionist coup in China, I went to a Jimmy Buffett concert. I had listened to some Jimmy Buffett songs because Jimmy Buffett sort of had one foot in youth culture and one foot in the country western culture. He came to Chicago and he had his band, which was called the Coral Reefer Band. And of course, reefer was a play on words. On the one hand, it referred to the Caribbean influences in his music, but then it was also reefer. And at this Jimmy Buffett concert, there were lots of reefer. There were a lot of jokes from the stage from Jimmy Buffett and the band about reefer, and a lot of people in the audience were smoking reefer. In the audience, there were a lot of youth from the middle class, but there were also a lot of young white proletarians there who were into all of this. And this might seem odd, but even in the form of all this talk about reefer and the people joking about it, there was a certain rebellious edge, and it made me think. We've gotten into tailing after more intermediate sections of the workers, or even the more backward among the white workers. There are workers, including among the white youth, who are more alienated and rebellious than many of the more stable and more conservative tending workers among whom we had been focusing much of our work. It is right to have a strategic orientation toward winning as many as possible among the more immediate workers and even more backward workers to socialism, but this should not be our main focus. In a way, this Jimmy Buffett concert, while in and of itself a small thing, was part of provoking questions in my mind politically and ideologically. This notion that it was better to appeal to a rebellious edge among the youth rather than seeking to build class consciousness among the broad masses of workers spread further than the RCP. Anti-populism and the idea that average working class Americans were the enemy seeped into almost all of the communist movement. The 1984 Jesse Jackson presidential campaign in the Democratic primary and Harold Washington's campaign for mayor of Chicago attracted significant support from communists and ex-communists. But overall, the early 1980s marked what can accurately be described as the Great Retreat. Communist organizations in America largely declined in membership, and those who remained focused on a specific niche on the fringes of U.S. society for recruitment, no longer aiming to win over the bulk of the population to an anti-imperialist united front. The Communist Party USA became almost invisible, working within the Democratic Party, claiming that Republicans represented creeping fascism. The Workers' World Party focused on staging liberal rallies and taking over the movement, becoming the stage managers and facilitators of regroupments of the 1960s peace marchers. Various Trotskyite and Maoist sects went into the labor union bureaucracy and attempted to maneuver and push more radical politics. Many former communists became academics and received grant money to write screeds about identity politics and postmodernism. The concept of white skin privilege was developed in academia by Noel Ignatin, an NCM activist and labor organizer who became a professor at Harvard University. He argued that white skin privilege was what had prevented the NCM from being successful in winning over white workers to anti-imperialism during the 1970s. The anti-populism of woke pseudo-leftism may have originally begun as an honest attempt to interpret the failure of the NCM by former communists. However, in the early years of the 20th century, it became clear that writings about postmodernism and identity politics were being promoted by the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller think tanks, and the Ivy League universities. Voices like those of Bell Hooks, Robin DiAngelo, and Judith Butler were being used to craft a new ideology that saw white workers as the enemy and felt it was the duty of the morally superior college educated whites to keep them in line. Intersectionality was intended to help purify the image of the United States so it could go around the world toppling governments in the name of human rights. The academic woke current rejects Marxism as class reductionist and is heavily tied in with U.S. intelligence and its color revolution regime change apparatus, and essentially just continued the work of Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, and Irving Howe, Partisan Review, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The decision of most remaining Marxist sects in America to cooperate with the efforts of the well-funded woke apparatus is based on the assumption, learned during the NCM, that average Americans have no revolutionary potential. It also fits in with the logic of the Boston Trap, that offering support or engaging in dialogue with any section of society declared right-wing or fascist by the establishment is a tragic, almost unforgivable blunder. At this time, Americans are more anti-war, more class-conscious, more critical of the police state, and more open to class struggle rhetoric than ever before. The only reason we have not seen a revolutionary upsurge in the United States amid what should be a perfect storm is the conscious infiltration and manipulation of communist groups and their confused belief that average Americans are unreachable and undesirable. If there is to be any hope for moving the United States toward anti-imperialism and socialism, conscious communist activists must repudiate the Great Retreat and the Boston Trap. They must instead find a way to go out of the movement to the masses and build a base among the sections of the population that are at odds with the establishment. The Bolivarian coalitions. One of the biggest developments in international politics so far in the 21st century has been the Bolivarian movement of Latin America. It is worth carefully examining how it is that a mass anti-imperialist and socialist movement was able to take power in many different countries throughout the Western Hemisphere and hold onto this power amid a huge effort to roll it back. The first thing to understand is that throughout the Cold War, the United States largely backed military governments in South and Central America. Bonapartist authoritarian regimes served to lock societies down and prevent what had happened in Cuba from spreading to other countries in what the United States considered its backyard. Figures like Somoza in Nicaragua, Rios Montt in Guatemala, and various military juntas that held power throughout the region were based among the light-skinned military elite that inherited its wealth and position from Spanish colonialism. These forces were viciously anti-communist and saw indigenous peoples as inferior savages. However, they were also fiercely nationalistic and held on to power by handing out the goods among their own social caste. These regimes, backed by the United States, made it impossible for communists to organize among the urban proletariat. Student activists and labor agitators were routinely disappeared by the regimes. Communists throughout South and Central America were forced to wage guerrilla warfare in the countryside. The Cuban government served as an organizing center for the various armed factions that emerged in the 60s and 70s to fight the military juntas. The Tricontinental Congress, founded by Che Guevara, aimed to help various Guevarian, Foucaultist, and Maoist guerrilla campaigns to be successful. The Cuban Revolution came to power in this manner in 1959. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas were able to take power with such tactics 2 decades later. However, The United States was able to offer military and intelligence support and enable the prevention of such victories elsewhere. The horrors of the Contra War in Nicaragua, the various paramilitaries in Colombia, the arming of drug cartels, and the counterinsurgency operations that transformed into genocidal massacres of indigenous people have been revealed in decades since. The flow of U.S. weapons and the arming of some of the most ruthless forces still haunts the region, and the inflow of migrants to the United States has been a direct consequence. The body count of U.S. policy in Central and South America, if one adds up all those killed in massacres of indigenous people, killed by drug cartels and paramilitaries armed by the United States, as well as deaths resulting from chronic poverty and underdevelopment, kept intact by U.S. operations to prevent socialism and development, is probably in the millions, perhaps tens of millions. Regardless, as the Soviet Union was in decline and the danger of communist revolution in Latin America faded, the United States turned on many of its long-standing allies. The communists, who protested for an end to military rule and civil liberties, were joined by well-funded human rights activists who wanted an open society. George Soros and the CIA's color revolution apparatus helped secure an end to military rule and the establishment of free elections in various countries. This was done to serve the needs of Wall Street. Austerity policies are much easier to impose in the context of a weak government that is constantly going bankrupt and begging the IMF for more development loans. The American economist, Jeffrey Sachs, oversaw Bolivia selling off its state assets and shredding its domestic industries with a democratic government making it happen. Ecuador went through a similar process. In 1989, the capital city of Venezuela exploded in rage in response to a dramatic increase in the costs of public transportation. The riot was known as the Caracazo, and it laid the basis for a military leader named Hugo Chavez to attempt a coup in February of 1992. Chavez failed to seize power and was imprisoned, but he was released later because many among the Venezuelan elite sympathized with him and wanted to stop the economic demolition the country had been enduring at the hands of the neoliberal economists and the U.S.-led international institutions. During the 1990s, Cuba and the various communist parties of Latin America reoriented their strategy. In the context of open societies, they could publicly organize and operate within urban centers again. Cuba held international conferences about neoliberalism and oriented the communists away from guerrilla warfare toward a strategy of building united fronts against economic cutbacks. The strategy of building up a large coalition against neoliberalism and mobilizing big sectors of the population to become politically involved became the new tactical orientation for the new situation. The FARC rebels in Colombia refused to abandon armed struggle in 1992 after their political wing, the Communist Party, voted to enter the government. As a result, Cuba terminated its relationship with the FARC, and Fidel Castro denounced the group for fetishizing armed struggle and not shifting its tactics. Explaining why Cuba ended its relationship with the FARC, Fidel Castro wrote, "The Colombian Communist Party never contemplated the idea of conquering power through the armed struggle. The guerrilla was a resistance front and not the basic instrument to conquer revolutionary power, as it had been the case in Cuba." FARC leader Manuel Marulanda conceived a long and extended struggle. I disagreed with this point of view, but I never had the chance to talk with him. I have expressed very clearly our position in favor of peace in Colombia, but we are neither in favor of foreign military intervention nor of the policy of force that the United States intends to impose at all costs on that long suffering and industrious people. I have honestly and strongly criticized the objectively cruel methods of kidnapping and retaining prisoners under the conditions of the jungle. The victory of Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela and other parts of Latin America has been the result of anti-imperialist united fronts polarizing society against neoliberal economics. The victory of Hugo Chavez in the 1998 elections was the result of a very big coalition being created to support his movement for the Fifth Republic. Chavez said he was a Bolivarian after Simon Bolivar, the hero of South American anti-colonialism. In his early years, Chavez said he did not believe in capitalism or socialism, but the third way, and what was best for Venezuela. He promised to end the neoliberal policies that were weakening the Venezuelan nation. After getting elected, Chavez deployed the military and mobilized the population to help those affected by mudslides and heavy rains. Chavez used his TV broadcasts to whip up an atmosphere of brotherhood and solidarity, having his supporters build Bolivarian circles in their communities to mobilize disaster relief. In the wave of patriotism and enthusiastic community service that followed, he was able to push through a new constitution. Chavez then faced an attempted coup in 2002, but was brought back into power due to an uprising of rank-and-file soldiers. The following year, Chavez announced he was moving Venezuela toward 21st century socialism and solidified the country's relationship with Cuba. Cuban doctors were brought in to provide health care for low-income people, and Cuban literacy volunteers began providing education. The indigenous peoples of the country, who had long been left out of the political process, suddenly became empowered as Chavez foot soldiers against the elite. Revenue from the state-run oil company paid for it, and Chinese investment also facilitated Venezuela's economic expansion. In Bolivia, a similar process was carried out with Evo Morales, a man of indigenous heritage who voiced support for the miners' strikes and fights against the privatization of water. After being elected president, Morales began the process of transitioning his country toward 21st century socialism, aligning with Cuba and China. At the same time, the Sandinistas returned to power in Nicaragua in 2006. Bolivarian socialism in Latin America, which has held on to power in Venezuela and Nicaragua despite an onslaught and series of defeats elsewhere, was an expression of a number of different trends. It represented the political awakening of the dark-skinned majority in Latin America, which had previously been left out of politics. It represented a rejection of neoliberal economics and the total erosion of domestic industries overseen by the United States during the 1990s. Bolivarianism was dependent on two major factors in order to stay in power. The first being the dramatically high oil prices created by the Bush administration and its invasion of Iraq. The second is the inflow of investment and the construction of infrastructure that China oversaw. A number of different trends in Latin America came together, and in certain areas, revolutionaries were able to tactically maneuver and oversee a transition to socialism. A kind of perfect storm and society-wide crisis had erupted, and some were able to seize the moment. This required dramatically changing their tactics for a new situation. The politics espoused by Bolivarian socialism is certainly not traditional Marxism-Leninism. It is a mixture of Marxism, economic populism, nationalism, liberation theology, indigenous traditions and spiritual practices, and much more. Bolivarian socialism is quite diverse and uses different emphases and messaging in different countries. Bolivarianism more or less gives voice to a number of different trends within Latin American society and ideas that are already quite widespread among the population. This is how a serious political movement operates. One can compare this with how the socialism with Chinese characteristics that developed as a result of Mao's revolution gave voice to aspects of Chinese culture and tradition. Mao Zedong was able to harness the power of the already existing peasant movement in China to take power. In his 1927 essay, he urged the Chinese Communist Party to drastically reorient its tactics in order to capture the energy of peasant rebellions. He wrote, "In a very short time, in China's central, southern, and northern provinces, several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash all the trammels that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will sweep all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry into their graves. Every revolutionary party and every revolutionary comrade will be put to the test, to be accepted or rejected as they decide. There are three alternatives: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese person is free to choose, but events will force you to make the choice quickly." Successful revolutionaries do not create unrest and divisions in order to take power. Rather, they capture the energy of the unrest and divisions that have already been created by material conditions. They maneuver within the wider existing social forces, strategically positioning themselves and entering alliances to give voice to much bigger, widespread currents. This scientific understanding of how revolutions occur and how societies can be transformed needs to be grasped by those operating within the United States as the country proceeds on the path of a long-term crisis. Defending American values. What feelings among Americans could be given expression by a mass socialist and anti-imperialist movement? It may be too early to give definite answers, and this may be clearer as the crisis develops, but some speculation is certainly permissible. In his 1937 text, Freud and Marx, A Dialectical Study, the British Marxist R. Osborne quoted Georgy Dimitrov's observation about fascists' ability to capture the souls of countries and communism's weakness in doing so. Dimitrov wrote, "One of the weakest aspects of the anti-fascist struggle of our parties lies in the fact that they react inadequately and too slowly to the demagogy of fascism, and to this day continue to look with disdain upon the problems of the struggle against fascist ideology. We must under no circumstances underrate this fascist capacity for ideological infection. On the contrary, we must develop for our part an extensive ideological struggle on the basis of clear popular argument and a correct, well thought out approach to the peculiarities of the national psychology of the masses of the people. The fascists are rummaging through the entire history of every nation so as to be able to pose as the heirs and continuers of all that was exalted and heroic in its past. While all that was degrading or offensive to the national sentiments of the people, they make use of as weapons against the enemies of fascism. The new-baked National Socialist historians try to depict the history of Germany as if for the last 2,000 years, by virtue of some historical law, a certain line of development had run through it like a red thread, which led to the appearance on the historical scene of a national savior, a messiah of the German people, a certain corporal of Austrian extraction. Mussolini makes every effort to capitalize the heroic figure of Garibaldi. The French fascists bring to the fore as their heroine Joan of Arc. The American fascists appeal to the traditions of the American War of Independence, the traditions of Washington and Lincoln. The Bulgarian fascists make use of the national liberation movement of the 70s and its heroes beloved of the people, Vasil Levski, Stefan Courage, and others. Communists who suppose that all this has nothing to do with the cause of the working class voluntarily relinquish to the fascists, falsifiers, all that is valuable in the historical past of the nation, in order that the fascists may bamboozle the masses. Osborne accompanies his quotation from Dimitrov by saying, "We have defined leadership from the psychoanalytic standpoint as the capacity to stand in the emotional relationship of the father of childhood days. Whether this definition is agreed with or not, there are certain emotional factors whose existence will raise no dispute. A need for protection, for someone to love, who will shoulder one's burdens and accept one's responsibilities. These are universal factors in leadership. It is irrelevant for the moment that some leaders deceive the people into believing that they can and will give this protection. The fact is that they are believed and consequently attract the emotional allegiance of which I have spoken. That the need for leadership is universal is hardly disputable. Sometimes it may be highly rationalized in allegiance to abstract ideas of love and truth, or admiration for a person because of the intellectual quality of his works. But most often, the emotional nature of the need is very apparent. What is also easily established is that the leaders of movements, groups, and religious bodies become endowed with qualities which mark them out from the common run of mankind. In some cases, this belief is consciously nurtured, but it is not only necessary for communists to associate their present struggle with the heroic figures of past struggles. They must also identify those traditional figures who are loved and respected with someone in the present. That is part of the successful technique of the fascist leaders, who have claimed to be the modern counterpart of the heroic figures in national history. If people have this capacity to love and to idealize individuals, it is better, after all, that they expend it on individuals whose lives and deeds have really deserved for them this love and reverence. And it is a psychologically sound measure to keep such people before the masses as an incentive and guide to the overcoming of difficulties on the road of social progress. Those who seek to push the U.S. into the anti-imperialist camp and toward socialism must present themselves as the defenders and inheritors of all that the American people already love. In the current circumstances, this may prove to be much easier than expected. For centuries, America has been known as the land of innovators and hard workers. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, "It seemed as if New England was a region given up to the dreams of fancy and the unrestrained experiments of innovators." Anna Louise Strong described how Americans are known around the world for being motor-minded and fanatical in their pursuits. Across the planet, the USA has cultivated an image for itself as a land of work hard and achieve your dreams. The deeply held religiousness of many Americans is currently at odds with the liberal order. It should not therefore be shocking that the lockdowns, the degrowth fascism, and the cynicism of the low-wage police state are extremely unpopular. A so-called nation of immigrants that have been pumped with Horatio Algier rags to riches stories since childhood does not appreciate having cold water poured on its inner enthusiasm. It is also worth noting that the United States, far more than most Western countries, is a stronghold of religious fanaticism. 2 U.S. states have opted not to outlaw the practice of snake handling. Various religious sects and divergent brands of spiritual practice proliferate among the U.S. public. While liberalism seeks to impose itself on society at large, with Netflix psyching up its audiences about cults and promoting religious skepticism, a big chunk of the U.S. public maintains a liberal worldview. Many Americans have been brought up from childhood to believe that the greatest way to live one's life is in devotion to a cause. In 1934, Liberty magazine commissioned exiled ex-Bolshevik Leon Trotsky to write an essay called "If America Should Go Communist." In his essay, Trotsky wrote that he did not believe religious fanaticism would be a barrier to the eventual socialist revolution in America, and that, in fact, it would probably aid in the process. Trotsky wrote, "Even the intensity and devotion of religious sentiment in America will not prove an obstacle to the revolution. If one assumes the perspective of Soviets in America, none of the psychological brakes will prove firm enough to retard the pressure of the social crisis. This has been demonstrated more than once in history. Besides, it should not be forgotten that the Gospels themselves contain some pretty explosive aphorisms." It is an odd twist of fate that two of the key components of Americanism that have laid the basis of anti-communism are now at odds with the liberal order. For years, Americans were told to hate Russia and China because in our land of free markets, anyone who works hard enough can become a millionaire. Now, the U.S. elite urges Americans to accept poverty to stop climate change. The American elite is working to convince the public that less is more, while China surges ahead with a new millionaire every day and hundreds of millions lifted from poverty. Americans have likewise been told for generations to hate communism because the atheistic adherents of dialectical materialism oppose the faith of their fathers and would cut them off from the beauty of spiritual life and the clarity of belief. But now, the American elite tells them to be lukewarm and passionless and to view every cause and creed with skepticism. Meanwhile, socialism in Latin America is rising with slogans like Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. Hugo Chavez told his followers that Jesus Christ was the greatest socialist in all of history. While the West descends into a land of cynicism and hopelessness, it is the anti-imperialists of the world that boil with passion, willing to die for the cause of defeating the satanic order of greed and bringing in a new world of compassion and human brotherhood. Even American patriotism is at this point being condemned by the American elite. Americans have been told communism is un-American and contrary to the country's foundational principles of freedom. Becoming an adherent of Marx means spitting on the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the beauty of the American flag. Yet, now social media is mobilizing young people to tear down monuments. The Founding Fathers are commonly described as racist slaveholders. The American people are told that rather than being proud of their country, they should put on a sackcloth and repent for centuries of white privilege and a lack of racial awareness as the country collapses into the open international system and deeper poverty. Americans who want to see their wages and living standards increase are told this is racist because the economic deterioration is simply losing their privilege. This, of course, creates an opening for socialists to become the bearers of a new kind of patriotism. We can tell the American people to not be full of shame, but to be proud of their heritage in defeating the British Empire, defeating the London aligned Confederates, building the labor movement, standing with Russia and China against the Nazis, and much more. As bourgeois patriotism, steeped in anti communism, dies, and even the U.S. military faces an attempted wokeification, the revolutionaries can bring forward pride in the heritage of John Brown, Harriet Tubman, Gus Hall, Huey Newton, and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Patriotism is being handed to us as a gift by the ruling class, along with religion and passion and American innovation. Everything that America has been said to stand for is now being abandoned and chucked into the garbage by the ruling class as they move to lock down society amid an economic crisis. They are handing it to us and to anti imperialism as a gift. The deeply held sentiments of the masses, their desire to live and not be degrown to save the profits of the elite, are just waiting to be hijacked by those with serious political vision. The homeless encampments across the major cities and rage filled youth trapped in debt and hopelessness are just waiting to be transformed into an army of liberation, a mass movement of resistance. The question is whether or not those who want a real socialist movement in America will be smart enough to seize hold of all this great potential. Country Joe and the Fish. Seizing the moment will require adopting a new mindset in relation to the American people. Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, the two key leaders of communism in the 20th century, were effective mass organizers because they had a deep understanding and connection with their own respective peoples. One of the rock and roll bands that performed at Woodstock was called Country Joe and the Fish. While it may come as a surprise, the performers were the children of Communist Party USA members, and their name was an homage to Stalin and Mao. Mao Zedong instructed his followers that the masses are the water, revolutionaries are the fish. He urged Chinese communists to become deeply connected with the population, to lose any elitist notions they held onto, and go among the people. Mao wrote, "How should we judge whether a youth is a revolutionary? How can we tell? There can only be one criterion, namely, whether or not he is willing to integrate himself with the broad masses of workers and peasants and does so in practice. If he is willing to do so and actually does so, he is a revolutionary. Otherwise, he is a non-revolutionary or a counter-revolutionary. If today he integrates himself with the masses of workers and peasants, then today he is a revolutionary." Like Mao was a fish swimming among the masses, Stalin was Country Joe, the son of a bootmaker from a small village in Georgia. Stalin's teen years were spent in a Russian Orthodox seminary being trained for the priesthood. Historian Simon Montefiore described Stalin's mass organizing methods this way. Stalin was hostile to bumptious intellectuals, but he was less with the less educated worker revolutionaries, who did not arouse his inferiority complex. He played the teacher, the priest. The workers listened reverently to this young preacher, and it was no coincidence that many of the revolutionaries were seminarists, and the workers often pious ex-peasants. Trotsky, agitated in another city, remembered that many of the workers thought the movement resembled the early Christians and had to be taught that they should be atheists. The 1960s rock band Country Joe and the Fish drew its name from rural village-born Joseph Stalin, Country Joe, and Mao Zedong. The masses are the water, revolutionaries are the fish. Che Guevara is widely quoted as having said, "At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It is impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. Communists in America must actively learn to have great feelings of love for the people and know them better than they know even themselves. A real revolutionary movement in America will require the bulk of the population, the broad masses in their millions, to become involved in the political process and take history into their own hands. Communists must approach them as such. It is them, not us, who will be the decisive factor. They will do things that amaze us and far surpass our own bravery and strength. All we can hope to do is offer the guidance and direction to point the explosion that is coming in the right direction. Ultimately, they will be the protagonists, the leading actors of the struggle to come. We will simply function as stage managers and producers, enabling them to shine before the world and perform the magical acts of beauty we know they have always been capable of." Mao Zedong wrote, "The masses are the real heroes, while we ourselves are often childish and ignorant. And without this understanding, it is impossible to acquire even the most rudimentary knowledge." Out of the movement to the masses. As the crisis in the United States and the rest of the world deepens, much is unclear, but a few things can be safely predicted. First, the ruling class of the United States will become more thoroughly divided. The ultra rich and their loyalty to the global financial system will put them at further odds with the military industrial complex and the lower levels of capital that seek to see their profits expand. The efforts to transition the United States to a society that fits into an Atlanticist model of international trade, with Southern California and New York City as globalist trading hubs and the rest of the country as an unused flyover country, will garner more and more opposition. Second, the economic consequences of the breakdown of capitalism will leave more and more people behind. Desperation will grow greater. Hunger and homelessness will expand. The efforts to eradicate the aristocracy of labor and collapse the United States into the open international system will create more and more resistance among different layers of the population. Third, in addition to the economic crisis, the spiritual and ideological crisis will also grow deeper. The lack of ideology, the lack of collective identity and meaning, will cause more and more younger Americans to search for a purpose in life and a movement they can join to find meaning. Some will be succumbed by the pessimism and hopelessness, the cynical wrecker mentality, but others will not and will press forward and join in an optimistic current of resistance. The tasks once taken on by the Communist Party and the new communist movement are now continued by the Center for Political Innovation. CPI was conceived in 2020 as a vehicle for doing what is largely not being done, promoting a brand of anti-imperialist and socialist politics that is aimed at the bulk of the American people. CPI has put forward its 4-point economic plan. CPI has also published a number of books and convened conferences in a variety of different corners of the country, intended for the purpose of cultivating a group of people dedicated to these politics. The CPI maintains a relationship with various anti-imperialist forces around the world and works to publicize and create sympathy for them among the U.S. working class, while promoting opposition to the big monopolies and their low-wage police state. Unlike the various Marxist groupings that have emerged in the last 2 decades, CPI maintains no illusions of being the vanguard party. We are not a Leninist party formation or an electoral entity. Rather, the CPI is simply an educational project taking on the specific task of laying the ideological and intellectual foundations of the coming revolution. CPI will carry out a strategy of top and bottom organizing. While we win over, utilize, and train more and more people in our own movement of anti imperialism and our unique ideological tradition, we will also make ourselves useful to forces within the power structure that are resisting the drive toward degrowth, fascism, and a new world war. As U.S. society continues to polarize around the question of imperialism and war, we will position ourselves solidly with those opposed. CPI already fits into a much bigger trend within U.S. society. A mishmash of forces of diverse political origins are coming together to denounce the flow of weapons to Ukraine, to oppose censorship and police state repression, and to demand the economic rebirth of the country. The Rage Against the War Machine protests involving libertarians and socialists together are a big step forward. As these trends proliferate, different forces will take on different tasks, running for office, organizing protests, building international and domestic relationships, etc. CPI will play only one specific role, the role of teaching ideology and building community around it, laying the foundations for others to do important work in different areas. There is no question that if current trends continue, at some point the crisis will take on a more severe character. The divisions in the ruling class will become far deeper, and the suffering of the masses will become much more acute and intolerable. In such circumstances, CPI will have laid the foundations for something much different to be formed to serve the needs of this historic moment. It will be the Center for Political Innovation and its organizational and ideological successors that will have laid the foundations and created the network necessary for resisting fascism. We will have popularized the notion of a government of action that fights for working families and put forward serious policy solutions to liquidate the economic crisis. Our work will enable the people to know what they are fighting for and to know who their natural allies around the world will be as they resist the rise of a low-wage police state. Liberalism, the worldview that puts the individual above all else, is doomed. Human beings are collective creatures, and all that human beings have ever achieved has been collective in nature. Human beings always seek to advance toward a higher plane, a higher mode of production, a larger population, a more comfortable life, and a more sustainable relationship with nature. Humanity will continue to march forward beyond the narrow confines of the irrational profit system. A liberalism will triumph, and the United States will join the rest of the world in abandoning an economic system that puts profits before people and creates poverty amid abundance. Technology will be freed from the artificial restraints of the capitalist system, and the human race will soar to new heights. New sources of energy will be discovered. Humanity will expand its existence beyond this single planet. A life that is unimaginable to us in our time will be enjoyed by our descendants as the epic march of human progress continues at an even faster pace. The 21st century will undoubtedly be remembered as a difficult period of transition, filled with hardships, setbacks, and victories. But those in future generations will undoubtedly celebrate and admire our courage and our ability to keep pressing forward when it seemed the entire weight of the old order was coming down on us. Marx wrote, "Proletarian revolutions, like those of the 19th century, constantly criticize themselves, constantly interrupt themselves in their own course, return to the apparently accomplished in order to begin anew. They deride with cruel thoroughness the half measures, weaknesses, and paltriness of their first attempts, seem to throw down their opponents only so the latter may draw new strength from the earth and rise before them again more gigantic than ever, recoil constantly from the indefinite colossalness of their own goals until a situation is created which makes all turning back impossible, and the conditions themselves call out, Hic Rhodus, hic salta. Here's the rose, now dance. We must keep with us the words of the man did so much to start China. We must keep with us the words of the man who did so much to start China on the road of colossal transformation and national resurrection, and never forget that our own conscious actions and the boldness to carry them out, despite the risks, can be decisive in changing the course of history. Dare to struggle, dare to win. At the opening ceremony of the 2022 Chicago Conference, members of the Center for Political Innovation display anti-imperialist flags along with the U.S. flag as the national anthem plays. Okay. Let's cut that out. It'll put me back on the screen here. Woo, we made it. I got to cut out. Okay. Let's cut that out. Find where I'm at. Okay, let's split there. Edit. Split regions at playhead. Delete. Save. All right. So everybody, hey, now you have to tell us what you think. Oh man, you gotta put me on the spot at 1:30 in the morning. What do I think? Oh man, it's so much, buddy. It's so good. I mean, I absolutely love it. You just put it all together. You put it all together. I really like that. The like last 3 pages were just like, it goes. It's so beautiful. It's funny because like when I'm reading it, I need to go away and think about it because I was more like, man, I didn't say the word "the," and then I went back and said it. I didn't know Mr. Maupin would be here on the spot. To ask me what I thought. He did say I did great work. And Mr. Wonderful was in the background too. Mr. Wonderful is wonderful. He's always sticking around. I love, let's say this, because I'm still going to read the appendix. So let's say this. Oh, I could. Oh man, that's awesome. I really like, in my own life, I've been struggling with how to integrate my religious faith of Christianity in with being a communist. Some bad things happen in the Soviet Union, we all know about. And it's been interesting to see the more that I've dug into, the more you dig into Christianity, eventually you go back to the Catholic Church, and then you go back to the Orthodox Church, and I'm like this return to my youth when I read these people talk about communism or Bolshevism. They start to say that it's just Satanism, and then I feel like I'm 8 years old again, and I'm like, it's really sad to me. Like one of the people I read a book on nihilism by a follower of Alan Watts, named Seraphim Rose, and he I think his parents bought him a little piece of land in Northern California, and he started his own, I don't know what they call it in the Orthodox Church up there, his little church, I guess, parish, I don't know, in the woods. Very 1960s hippie. He also wrote a book. It's like something like an Orthodox survival guide, which he just throws Alan Watts under the bus right out of the beginning, like that he's leading people to the devil. And then he just portrays Lenin as just a demon. And I'm like, it's just so sad to me that they don't have a deep understanding of anything we read in this book. They don't. I mean, I know bad things happened between the two groups, of course. But I think they have a lot to learn from each other because, well, just to share my own thoughts on this. Like, so the Orthodox Church in Russia hates the Bolsheviks. I find that interesting because why, like, it's that line from The Grapes of Wrath where he's like, you who own the world, the owners, he's like, I want you to know, it's either chapter 12 or chapter 14 at the end. He's like, I want you to know that these men, Paine, Jefferson, Lenin, Marx, these men are results, not causes. Results, not causes. They are, the world was in some sense intolerable. And then socialism rose up to fill a role that, it pains me to say, the church was obviously not fulfilling in some way. If they were pulling it off, then the socialist movement never would have been necessary. I think the other side went a bit too far. In certain ways, their mistakes were made, and I always appreciate Mr. Maupin for coming out and saying that mistakes were made. We're not apologizing for every single thing that was done. It wasn't 100% perfect, but some amazing things took place, which made people's lives much more worth living. It appears that the people who the church revere the most seem to be the people who go in the woods forever and spend their life repenting of their sins. And I rather live in the arena and try to fix the world in some way. And that's my favorite part of what we're trying to do with CPI, is a fusion of these two ideas. We don't have to, if we don't want to. I mean, some people, we're not all believers in CPI, and that's fine. I like that. I don't like this ostracism, like you're not one of us. You know, you don't have the one true way. I find a lot of overlap between the church and the party, like revisionism, anti-revisionism, orthodoxy, heterodoxy. I mean, it's kind of funny that the two were such at odds, but I'm really glad that we have a fusion in this philosophy and ideology that we're developing. And for me, I'm very excited to learn more about. I wish I'd got to go on that trip to Nicaragua. I'll just have to take it down there myself and see how exactly they're doing the fusion of socialism and Christianity, because it seems to be working okay. And in my heart of hearts, it seems to be, it's what always made sense and what's clicked. And I'm just grateful to have an organization where I can develop those ideas and not feel ashamed of being either one. Actually trying to figure out a way to fuse the two. I have a book I want to get. I'll show you. Never spell his name right. Maybe it's a U. Yeah, this one. Let's see if I can share it here before I go. Present. Present. Share tab. Yeah, this one. I want to read My Russia by the Zyuganov, because I know Zyuganov is an Orthodox Christian like Putin, and he's the head of the Communist Party of Russia. So I feel like there will be some interesting answers for people trying to fuse these two world-changing philosophies for the better and make peace with that. Because I think in America, that's going to be huge. It's going to be a huge deal because a lot of our supporters, which would seem crazy 20 years ago, like you talked about, a lot of our supporters will be evangelicals and military type people, conservatives, liberals. Liberalism is a squishy word because you can go way liberal. It's just, I was thinking about this today, how like Marxists, I feel like we go through this period where we're like, we're not liberals, or what's Mao's combat liberalism. But it's also in a way, I feel an outgrowth of the French Revolution, trying to right its wrongs and fulfill its promises is what Marxism is. So we want to still be tolerant for people. We want to, I can't imagine a government ruled by the church at this point. It just boggles my mind that some people want to bring back a king. I'm seeing more and more of this. I don't think so. Is that liberal? Separation of church and state? I don't know. I think there's some things there. So figuring out how people in power are able to retain their faith, use discernment, and take the reins of the state to make the world a better place. That's what I want to do. That's what I want CPI to help do. Because whoever has the reins of the state in America at this point do not appear to be Christian influenced. They appear to be the more this guy, Satan influenced. So I've been up way too late. I need to go to sleep in about, I got to work tomorrow. So anyway, I hope those were some good thoughts I shared, my friend. I dumped a few of things I've been wrestling with in my own head on you, but some people might think it's interesting, and we'll keep figuring it out. That's what I love about having a channel, and I'm so grateful for any of you guys that like my channel. I'll give props to Caleb. I wouldn't be doing this channel if it weren't for Caleb. He oh yeah, absolutely, buddy. I went to the CPI Kansas, and I kind of realized that I put myself out there now. If we're gonna have an FBI file, we might as well give him something to something to look at. If they're gonna look, let's give them a little dance. And I was also reading a book by David Hawkins. I think I'd first heard Russell Brand talk about reading the book Letting Go. And hey, thanks, Mr. Wonderful. Peace out, buddy. And I started reading a different book, and it's like shows the levels of consciousness. I'll put that up real quick, and then I'm going to bed. Actually a good one on Bitcoin Magazine, interestingly. What? No, I don't want to do that. Here we go. David Hawkins, Bitcoin Magazine. We're mixing streams here. Caleb, I would normally do this on a separate stream, but you asked me, so I'm gonna give you my ideas here. Okay, it's not that tab. I'm gonna present a different tab. This tab. Nope. This tab. Yeah. Well, this is the thing. He had these levels of consciousness, and it's just a metaphor. I mean, it's like, it's not exactly like Maslow's hierarchy. I mean, it is like that. Maslow's hierarchy isn't perfect, but it's an idea, you know. He talks about how like these are the levels of human consciousness. And I've felt before that my role in life is to help raise human consciousness in whatever way I can do it. And CPI is a great way for me to feel like I'm trying. I love that focus on education. Like that's our focus. But it's just how people can move up through these emotions. Like he said down here, like the bottom 5, you're not going to do anything. You're not going to read an ebook, or you're not going to read your friend's book on a YouTube channel. You know, you're not going to go to CPI Kansas and meet anybody. You're stuck. You hate life, you hate yourself, and this is where they want to keep people. And then this is where like a lot of like corporate culture is. There are a lot of debate bros on the internet. They live right at pride. I feel like they're very stuck on being right, and between pride and anger. There's somebody in this sphere this reminds me of. I'm not gonna bring up their name, but anyway, David Hawkins talked about how like force is the kind of like the energy of the world, and then power is the energy of God or the divine. And the flip point is courage. And I think I was reading this book when I went to CPI Kansas. I was right there, and it was clicking for me that like if you want to do anything cool in life, you got to have courage. And our society does not want anyone to have courage. Because we start causing problems once we have courage. Let me see if I can find it. I'll show you the exact one if anybody wants to watch it. Yeah, this is the one I've been reading. I was reading at the time. The Map of Consciousness Explained. I think it's like published after his death. And he's really anti-communist too, but I just kind of like when I read that, I pat him on his boomer head. And it's just that's what's so frustrating is like we have so much to do to educate people. And you know, some of these people have fantastic ideas. Like this idea has done so much for me. like pure reason is, you get Christ-like nature up here. The Buddha, Muhammad. These are the big ones. The Tao Te Ching, one of my favorites. But yeah, he'll like sneak in there stuff on Mao, and it's so shallow. It's not any real in-depth. He doesn't know anything about it. He knows what he's been told about it. And anyway, that's what I love this book as a step forward into educating the American masses. I'm so glad CPI exists as a thing, to a vehicle for us that actually do want to get off the internet and get in real life, as a thing to build community, meet each other. You meet some of our heroes and educate the population that socialism is actually what you've wanted all along. And the reason they told you it was evil was because they like their cushy place at the top of the stack. It doesn't mean we take all their stuff, or it doesn't mean we don't like wealth. It's all in this book. We love all that. We just want it for everybody. We want everybody to get rich. To be rich is glorious, says Dang. I did laugh at that part when the RCP had a death to Deng Xiaoping march. But anyway, I could go on and on and on and on. But I won't, because it's 2 a.m. But I love everybody that watched. Thanks so much for sticking by, Caleb. Another fantastic work. And I think I'm finish up the appendix. I don't know if I'll do it tomorrow. We'll see how I feel, because I got to work all day at the pharmacy. But I will celebrate. I did find out with you guys. Let me see if I can find this. I took a picture. Let me see if I can, before I go. This one. Let's see if I can share this. Can you share a picture? Maybe. You have no slides. Add a slide. No. Maybe I can make it big and I can show you that way. It'll be real pixelated. That's okay. Huh. Nope. It's on the wrong. Let's try to move it over here. Can I do that? No? This isn't working the way I wanted it to. Maybe I can move this over here. Nope. I gotta undo that. I'm gonna do this before I leave because I was excited about it. Okay. Make that big. All right. Check this out. I was proud about this. I'll make a video about it tomorrow. Okay. Present. Share screen. Look at that. Look at that. I did it. 1 million views. That's pretty exciting. But that's all to say, I never would have done that if I hadn't joined CPI, if I hadn't met my good friend Caleb, if CPI hadn't helped me believe in myself and have the courage to put myself out there. And it's just so exciting. I'm building a better life for myself. I'm building a better life for America. And CPI, Mr. Caleb Maupin, it's a huge reason that I have the courage and the momentum and the hope to put it out there, hope to change things for the better. So on that note, how much better can you get than that? You know, that's fun. That's fun. 1 million views. I love you all. Thank you, God. Thank you, Caleb. You did, buddy. You're the best. You did. And I hope I can make you believe in yours a little bit. We'll help each other. Comrades. Iron sharpens iron. All right. If you ever need anything, I'm always there. Wherever you need me, I'll be there. Wherever you want me, I'll be. I wonder if I get a copyright strike for this. I'll be around. All right. Love you guys. Peace out. See you later. Double click. Now, officially ended. Appendix coming soon. And then the official end nice product of the video, it'll be nice. It's going to be nice. I'm excited about it. All right. See ya.